a shipwreck site probably means that there were cannons on the ship. It could also mean that the ship was transporting cannonballs for trade or the market or such. But beyond that, cannonballs also hold several diagnostic principles that help us understand the timeline. So on very early shipwrecks, or at least in the very early shipwright history, cannonballs were actually commonly made out of stone. And this was because, as we talked about earlier, producing something that was iron was very costly. It was very expensive, even if molds were used. And so a lot of times they would make them out of stone, and other times you'd also have prisoners, just like prisoners today make license plates and such. You'd have prisoners make stone cannonballs, and that was an easy way to produce them. So the presence of stone cannonballs, although they might have been recycled and reused in later history, if you have that presence, that is an indicator that you might be looking at an early shipwreck. And if you have a mixture of stone as well as iron, you probably have something in the transitional period, because of course the transition from stone to iron didn't happen in one day. It was a fluid process, and they used the inventory that they had. And some also like to use stone cannonballs in addition to iron ones, because stones had the properties that made them shrapnel out more when they hit the object that they were aimed at. But that's one way that you can also observe the possible timeline of a shipwreck in just looking at the cannonball composition itself. Now you also have the shape of it. Now of course over time it will be deformed the more that it's degraded, but you also have the form in that, is it very spherical, were molds used, how developed were those molds, because obviously the more they used them the more uniform they became. And you also have the weight of the cannonballs. So especially in Spanish maritime history, you had different ships holding different weighted cannons, and different cannons would fire different cannonballs based upon the weight. So you could study the ship in that sense. And of course, depending on the environment that these cannonballs come to rest in, sometimes they're preserved and sometimes they're just liquid. They'll liquefy inside of the cementation that slowly builds up around them, and by the time you get into them it'll just be like a liquid metallic consistency. Alright, so in this case you have another example of items that you can see here with between the pottery and the rock, which was the cementation, and the mold of the spike. We can get more into that. This is another way that items are conglomerated together. Over time they become cemented together. But this is a piece of wood here actually. And for early shipwrecks, the presence of wood, unless in a very what's called an anoxic environment where there's no oxygen, because the biggest enemy for wood and wood preservation in shipwreck archaeology are teredo worms, because the teredo worms will slowly eat the wood, and then their excrement is often all that's left. So in early shipwrecks you can still see some structures, but likely if it's not an anoxic environment, what you're looking at is actually teredo excrement. And when you go to study that or recover any part of it, it will disintegrate into nothing. So when you actually have wood preserved, this is a really exciting find in underwater shipwreck archaeology, because it's not common. And so you can still see the grade of the wood, and if it's in good enough shape, you can take fractions of it or pieces of it and have a study done to determine whether or not you can find out what type of wood it is and perhaps how old it is, and then from there you can start looking at where that species of tree is available. And of course, if other aspects of the shipwreck lend to the knowledge of where in the world it was built, you could then start slowly decreasing it to a regional area, where if you know it's a North American built ship, then you can look at the species of tree, and then from there look at where that tree is available, and then additionally you can look at old mills that often use that wood. So that's one way you can start breaking it down. Another cool part of this are these old casts you see here, those round shapes there that are hollow. Those are the casts of where iron spikes were. And as I said, over time you start to form these levels of concretions around them, and that's just because of the time and environments they're exposed to. So over time you have this building of the incrustation, but you still have the degradation of the iron or metal inside. So it gets to a point in which you have either a complete loss of the iron, where you pull it out and there's nothing inside, or you pull it out and there's just liquefied metal inside, or you pull it out and the spike is literally starting to fragment apart. And you could still study perhaps what, its shape and what it looked like, but there's not much to look at, especially when it comes to earlier shipwrecks, like one of our sites being in Juno, being a possible 16th century ship. Very rare do you have anything more than a spike that's completely falling apart, if not liquefied already.